Welcome to the Korea Society. Starry Field, a memoir of lost history, is an intimate and touching debut from journalist Margaret Joo-hae Lee that uncovers her family's lost history that had been buried in the darkness of Korea's colonial decades. Margaret Joo-hae Lee is an Oakland-based writer and a former literary editor of The Nation magazine. Her articles, reviews, and interviews have been published in The Nation, Newsday, Elle, and Art News, among many others. Joining Margaret tonight on stage is Grace M. Cho, the author of Tastes Like War, a finalist for the 2021 National Book Award in Nonfiction and the winner of the 2022 Asian Pacific American Literature Award in Adult Nonfiction. She's professor of sociology and anthropology at College of Staten Island, CUNY. You'll have a chance to ask Margaret your own questions later this evening. If you're joining us for the live webcast, please send your questions via email, artsandculture@koreasociety.org. Starry Field and Tastes Like War is available for sale tonight, and Margaret will be signing books after the program. And we'd like to thank once again UME Books for handling the book sales tonight. And now, please join me in welcoming Margaret Joo-hae Lee and Grace M. Cho.
Thank you. Thank you. This is my first time moderating one of these, so be gentle. So Margaret is going to read from the book a little bit, but at first I wanted to just make a few comments about the book. I am really thankful for this opportunity to read this rare gift of a book. It's a really ambitious project in that it attempts to do so many things, and it succeeds at doing those things. It excavates a buried history of both Margaret's family and of Korea. It traces a long personal and intergenerational quest to recover that history, right? A 20-year period of working on this book. And it tells the story about the author as a Korean-American woman who spent most of her life in a state of unbelonging in an elusive search for home. This perpetual feeling of not being at home is a condition that I believe is emblematic of the Korean-American diaspora, because many Korean Americans of our generation and of our parents' generation were dislocated by war and dictatorship. Yet we live under a dominant national narrative in the US that calls the Korean War the Forgotten War and says that Koreans owe their independence from Japan to the US. Margaret's book, simply by recovering this lost family history and telling us the story of her grandfather, as well as that of her grandmother and other family members, complicates the dominant American narrative about our history because it enables us to remember the war from the experience of ordinary people who lived it. And it reminds us that Koreans fought for independence from Japan long before the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Margaret's grandfather, Lee Chol-ha, aka Sang-ya, or Starry Field, was a leader in that fight for independence, and his bravery and conviction led to his imprisonment and ultimately to his death. And yet, there was a decades-long silence about her grandfather's life. The silence in her family mirrored a national silence in South Korea. As Margaret captures through storytelling that is simultaneously powerful and tender, this psychic state of not knowing the past can be deeply unsettling. She writes about her grandfather, "I sense that the forgetting of his life is connected to why I have never really felt at home anywhere. Indeed, how can we feel at home when we can't locate our origins?" And so here, maybe Margaret can read a little bit to help us remember her grandfather's life and this lost history that is also a larger history.
Thank you, Grace. That was a beautiful introduction. I just want to mention that I spoke at the Korea Society in the year 2000 when I started this book. So it's great to be back. So it's like a full circle moment. And I have my kids here and various relatives and high school friends, and so it's a lovely homecoming of sorts. I'm going to read from a chapter called Reburial. My grandfather Ichul Ha is being buried again today. October 12th, 1995, in the Daejeon National Cemetery in South Korea, almost 60 years after he was buried the first time. That time, in 1936, my great-grandfather watched as the remains of his 27-year-old son were laid to rest in a mountain site he had originally reserved for himself. This time, uniformed military officers stand in salute, paying homage. This time, Korea exists as an independent country, albeit cut in two, and not a colony of Japan. This time, his eldest son, daughter-in-law, granddaughter, and grandson are in attendance, fresh from a trans-Pacific flight from the United States. This time, my grandfather will be buried in honor and not in shame. In the funeral photograph, the only photograph we have of him, the 19-year-old grandfather I never knew is devastated at being caught. Eyelids heavy with fatigue, hair shorn by him or his captors, I don't know. The lack of hair accentuates his squared-off forehead, a family trait handed all the way down to my brother Ed, recently graduated from college. It is Ed who carries our grandfather's framed image today under the searing early fall sun. My father discovered my grandfather's photograph in 1992 with the help of an old college mate from Seoul National University. The original black and white image measured approximately 2 by 3 inches, the standard ID for all occupants of the Sodaemun Hyungmuso, the prison reserved for political prisoners during the Japanese occupation. Forlorn, bereft, my grandfather's wide shoulders slumped forward, causing his loose tunic to gape at the neck. Residual baby fat weighs down his cheeks. The corners of his closed mouth turn downward. The lettering on the sash across his chest has been erased. My father covered it with whiteout. I asked my father why he altered the photo as we walk up the grand staircase behind Ed to the top tier of the cemetery. It wouldn't be proper, he whispers. I start to argue with him. Was he trying to save face in front of the relatives to hide the fact that we were using my grandfather's mugshot as his funeral photo? Did he still feel shame about my father's prison stay and the fact that he was a communist? My mother grabs my hand and widens her eyes, the signal for me to shut my mouth. No arguing in front of the relatives. The soldiers lead the procession and stop in front of the open row of grave sites to twirl their rifles in unison. Their staccato shouts drift over the valley below as they march off and allow the families to gather in front of the graves of their ancestors. I try to catch my brother's eye, to give him a silent pep talk, but his gaze is cast downward. I can tell he is worried that he might do the wrong thing and embarrass the family in some way. My father whispers in Ed's ear. Sweating in his black wool suit, Ed places our grandfather's photograph on a low table covered in white fabric. He turns around and looks toward my father for further guidance. My father holds up 2 fingers. Ed lowers his 6'2" frame to his hands and knees and bows his head in front of the picture. He stands up and bows again. My father and all of the surviving male members of the family follow his example. My mother and I, as well as the other female family members, stand behind the men, as is the custom. 2 days before, my grandfather's bones were exhumed from the family burial plot high up in the mountains surrounding the city of Gwangju. The grandfather I never knew exists in the here and now as a skeleton, an archaeological artifact excavated from a disintegrating wooden coffin. Resurrected, reborn, for a second chance at commemoration. A young man's bones transformed into a relic of an era no one wanted to remember. Until now. His modeled skeleton is encased in a shiny silver coffin covered with the South Korean flag, which has been placed behind the low table on which his photograph rests. Should I stop there? I'll go in. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. That was really beautiful, Margaret.
Oh, thank you.
So in this part that you read, I mean, it really sets the tone nicely for the whole book. It sort of evokes this idea of revision, right? Of the revision of your grandfather's story and the transformation of him from, a traitor to a patriot. And so it's interesting to think about it in a little bit in terms of history, because I think of that, 1995 as sort of the beginning of an era when South Korea is trying to, or it's starting to look at some of the episodes of the past,
Right.
That had been buried on a national scale. And so, and I think we're still currently in this phase. And it recalls some of the things that we've witnessed in South Korea over the last 2 decades regarding the exhumation of massacre sites. So, I'm thinking about the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Korea has done, along with regional associations, bereaved families associations, to locate these sites where hundreds of people at each one often were massacred for being communist. Often they were very innocent people. And so I wonder if you want to say anything more about the political context at the time in 1995, because, as I read it, I was thinking this was actually really early to be able to honor someone who had been known as a communist, as a patriot. So I wonder how you think of this in terms of like what allowed your grandfather to be his story to be revised at this time. What were the social and political conditions that allowed that to happen? And so, maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
So when my father started uncovering the history about his own father, my grandfather, he started looking through newspaper articles, and he was helped by his old college mate who found his the prison photograph, which is on the cover, Dr. Shin Young-ha, who is a very eminent professor of colonial history in Korea. And he was the one who encouraged my father to apply for a Patriots Medal in my grandfather's name. But he told him, he's like, you cannot say he was a communist. Don't put that in the application. You say that he was a nationalist and he opposed Japanese rule. So, and that's why my father that's why I was arguing with my father, because when I found out that my grandfather was a communist, I thought that was the most interesting part of his past. Me being a very, very liberal person working at The Nation magazine, which is the bastion of American communism in this country. So to me, I was like, wow, that's so interesting. And my father's like, do not, we're not advertising that. And that's why he was, my mother's telling me to shut up at the ceremony. It was interesting when I started digging into the past, helping my father. it was very difficult to find information. I thought my grandfather's records would be, I traveled to Korea, I thought they would be in an archive. I thought they would be in the library. That was what I expected. And everywhere where I went, they said, oh, those documents were burned during the war. I was hitting dead ends everywhere. And what I realized was that a lot of this documentation was being suppressed because people did not want to show that certain prominent families in Korea were collaborators with the Japanese. So that's one of the main narratives of the book, is me searching for my grandfather's information. For his prison records, for his interrogation records, because we knew that they existed because the Japanese were amazing record keepers. And also the copies, we haven't discussed this yet, but the copies my father remembered seeing as a child, and my grandmother ended up burning them during the Korean War.
That was actually going to be my next question, because it's such a, like a centerpiece of the story that you come back to again and again, this moment when your grandmother decides to burn the records. And even when you're getting your father to share his memories, that's where he starts. So you make a point of saying he begins there and then circles back to his childhood and then later talks about his adulthood. And so for the way that he narrated his life was that it began at the moment that your grandmother burned the records. Right. And so maybe you could say more about why this is so important to the story.
Well, it's almost like his father died again when the records were burned, because that's the only way my father knew about my grandfather. And my grandmother didn't show him the records. My father found them in her dresser and would go sneak into her room when she was off at church. And that's how he knew that his own father was involved with a movement. He didn't understand everything because he was a teenager, but he saw books that my father owned, books of Marx and Lenin and Goethe and Thomas Hardy, and books on math. And he saw these prison records, copies of his prison records, which he couldn't read because they were in classical Japanese, but he knew that they were there. And when my grandmother burned them during the Korean War, it was like his father was dead again, even though he never knew him. But every paper remained that he knew was gone. And he was that was a seminal moment in his life. Like, oh, now he's gone again.
Yeah. So in the chapter where I think you titled it "Lost History," the chapter when you first introduced us to the story of your grandmother burning the books and the records and his writings as well, because your grandfather wrote for a newspaper as well. Right. But then then it starts to take on another meaning. That act takes on another meaning that evolves throughout the book. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, my grandmother wasn't political. I don't think she really knew what my grandfather was exactly what his role was in the movement, but she knew that they were dangerous. Because other family members were trying to use them to gain favor with who they thought was first winning the war, which were the North Koreans. So one of my father's brothers was urging my grandmother to give him the records. Say, we can give these to the North Koreans, and then you'll gain favor, and maybe you'll get free education for the kids, because it looked like they were going to win the war. And my grandmother knew that, she had the presence of mind to know that you don't know what's going to happen in the war. And so she thought the best thing to do was burn them before they escaped their house and moved into the mountains to escape the troops. So that was a survival technique for my grandmother. She wasn't political at all. She was just trying to survive, like most people in Korea were during the war.
Yeah, I think at one point you had a line that was something like, when my grandmother burned the records, it changed the course of our family history, something like that. So I'm wondering if you could reimagine what that family history would look like if she had never done that.
Well, I
you
mean,
must imagine it sometimes, right?
if my father's uncle had taken, the records that branded my grandfather as a communist, then the family would have been branded as communists later when the South won, and would have been ostracized from the society. That's what happened to my dad's cousin. He joined the Workers' Party, without believing anything. It was an opportunist. He was very, very much an opportunist, because that's who he thought was going to win. And he couldn't get a job in his town. He was a mechanic, and he ended up driving a taxi driver, and he was shunned by society for the rest of his life. It was a brand, and that would have been a brand on our family.
Mm-hmm.
And I doubt my father could have gone to Solnash University. I doubt, a lot of things would have happened in the family.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting when I was doing the research and talking with professors of history. Many of them just assumed that my father came to the U.S. because my grandfather was a communist. They're like, oh, well, he could have never gotten a job as a professor
Mm-hmm.
in the Pak Chung-hee era if he was the son of a communist, and people would have known that because people look into your your family lineage. So I was so surprised. I'm like, oh, I had no idea. I didn't know that was the the atmosphere in Korea then.
Yeah, right. So your book sort of unfolds all of these revelations where you start to realize what it would have meant to have been branded as a communist because you discover these other family members.
Right.
I think there were a couple of them. And then there's that moment when your parents, even in Houston, because they're hosting someone who had been a dissident, that they are, sort of ostracized from their community.
Right.
So, I was reading this book simultaneously with, or maybe right after I had read Kim Dong-chun's The Unending Korean War, which was a really seminal work in South Korea. It came out in 2000. And there were a couple of quotes I just wanted to read because it resonated so much with your story. One is, branding someone as a red was practically a form of violence that could socially ostracize someone for life. Those accused of collaborating with the North were completely deprived of their status as citizens. They were stripped of all rights, and no matter what injustice they suffered, they had nowhere to turn to for help. And he also talked about how, as the battle lines are shifting and, the territory is shifting, ordinary citizens had no choice but to try to be loyal to whoever was in control. Right. And so I saw that reflected very much in your grandmother's decision to burn those books and those documents. And she was very wise. You said that there's a chapter where your uncle, I think it was Juan, says, it's your grandmother who's the real hero of the family. Because what we know now about the Korean War era, or, the all-out war era, 1950 to 1953, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that, at least 100,000 people in South Korea were killed in these anti-communist massacres, right? And so it could have been even worse than the ostracization that some of your family members faced. Right. Maybe there would be no future generations to uncover the history of your grandfather. So it's really chilling. To read this in light of this history. So I wanted to talk more about your interviews with your grandmother. And you noted on page 215 that you noticed a similarity in your grandmother's words in the first interview, and then again in this, I think it was the third interview, and you wrote, "We don't talk about painful things in our family. We swallow them whole and let them fester for generations." And so I was wondering, well, you can say more about the process of interviewing your grandmother and some of her reluctance to speak. But I'm also curious, because I think about this a lot as well as a writer, the tension between some family members need to understand the past and other family members desire to keep it buried.
Right.
Because
right.
it's sort of this perpetual tension
Yeah,
in a lot of
yeah.
Korean families and for a lot of memoir writers. And
Totally. A big part of my book are 3 interviews I conducted with my grandmother, 3 long-form oral histories, and that's how I organized my book. And my grandmother did not want to talk to me. She was like, "Why do you want to know about painful things?" She, staring at me, and I really had to convince her. And finally, what made her speak to me is that I told her it was for my career, and I was going to write a book, and if you want me to have a job, I have to do this. And so that's what convinced her, because she was about survival and wanting her grandchildren to have jobs. So that's what convinced her. And it was interesting. It was me and my mother. My Korean is not great. I can understand it. I can barely speak it. So my mother acted as my translator, and my father could not be in the room. He had to stand in the next room. She would not speak in front of my father. I think she felt a little bit guilty. So he stood out of her, eyesight and listened to the whole thing. And I started with her childhood, and she told stories that my father had never heard before. My grandmother never spoke about my grandfather, except to say that he made their lives difficult. And I think part of her really hated him, and I understand why. But once she started speaking, she couldn't stop. It was like these stories just poured out of her. And I think we did it over 3 or 4 days, and I recorded her. And the interviews were her childhood and then her marriage. She was married at age 16. My grandfather was 15. That was the tradition in Korea at the time. She never met my grandfather until their wedding day. And then she lived with my grandfather's family and was basically an indentured servant to his family. And it was something she was not prepared for. Her mother died when she was young, and her father remarried a couple of times and had other children. And my grandmother was basically protected by her own grandmother and didn't really know how to run a household. So it was a very traumatic time for her as a teenager, being pushed into a new house, new role. And I realized, I knew my grandmother because she would come live with us in Houston every couple of years. But to me, she was just this incredibly religious person that prayed every morning, and our interactions were fairly limited, and mostly she wanted me to read her Bible verses in English. And she was also, I would call her scary grandma, not not the warm and fuzzy type of grandmother. Very stern, never smiled. So when she opened up to me, that was the first time where I felt really connected to her as a person, because I'd never heard, her life story. She was born in 1908, and basically, Korean medieval time, very agrarian society, and died in the year 2000, when Korea is the most wired place in the world. Like her life spans so much change, and she's the survivor. She's why our family survived.
Yeah, it really struck me at the moment when you revealed that your father had never heard these stories, because it seems like this project was such a gift to your father.
Definitely.
Right?
Definitely.
Because it wasn't just that you recovered his father's legacy, but that you gave him access to his mother's stories.
Right.
And
right.
it was just really powerful and beautiful. So another one of the things that sort of struck me in the story, but in the way that you crafted it, is thinking about the ways that trauma and colonization leave an imprint on the body through, like the examples that I wrote down here were the H. pylori, and the tuberculosis.
Right.
Right? Because it seemed almost as if these were metaphors of a seed that is planted, like a seed of trauma or pain or injury that is planted early in life during the colonial period, during the war, that come to fruition decades later.
Right.
So I don't know if you did that intentionally, but that's sort of how I read it.
Yeah.
And it also seems to me that you are using memory and story as another type of imprint on the body, but one that heals. Because you use this it seemed like very deliberate language that sort of evokes the materiality of memory. Like you said that the stories that your Halmoni shared permeated your very being, were embedded in your body, that you needed to release them from your body. And that's when you begin the story to your children. And then you say in this address to your children, my story is one I hope you can let seep into your being. And so I just wonder if you could talk more about this idea of like the bodily nature of trauma, memory, story.
Sure. When I started this project 20 years ago, I never heard of the term intergenerational trauma, and probably most people hadn't at that time. It was pretty much relegated to psychology. It wasn't part of the lexicon like it is now. And once I started reading about it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what happened in my family and so many families. And since I wrote this book over 20 years, my conception of what it was has changed. When I started this book, I was a journalist. I thought this is the story of a lifetime, which is my family. And I was looking at it from a journalism lens. And when I started doing research, I thought of the book as a way for me to understand my father and also feel closer to him, because as an adult, I had kind of grown away from him. And you mentioned the tuberculosis. I just want to tell the audience. So my grandfather most likely contracted tuberculosis in prison. And he died at the age of 27, most likely from tuberculosis. And my father was exposed to tuberculosis from my grandfather when he was a baby. And he ended up, I guess it bloomed into the disease right after college. And he spent almost 2 years in a tuberculosis sanitarium. 40 years later, when he was living, he had gone back to Korea to live, but when I was an adult, when I was going to journalism school at NYU, my father's lungs started to bleed, and it was the scar from his tuberculosis gave way, and he had to have surgery in Korea, and basically during surgery, he lost a lot of his memory because of the anesthesia. And it was at this time where he was doing research into my grandfather, and I was going to journalism school, and my mother was saying, you need to help your dad. And I wanted to. It wasn't just because my mom said so. So that was how I started research for this book. So the legacy of the disease is definitely a metaphor that tied the generations together. And I love that you picked that up.
Yeah, and you mentioned that he contracted it in prison, and so the next question I had was about the scene when you're in the Soremon prison museum, and you feel the chill, like you sort of like have this bodily awareness of what your grandfather experienced in prison, in solitary confinement. But actually my question is about the scene that comes right before that, which is where you have this sudden pang for motherhood.
Oh, yeah.
And so I thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition. So I wonder if you could talk about how you put those two together, like your choices around doing that. And then maybe move into saying a little bit more about how your journey towards motherhood is reflected in this story.
Right. I don't think I answered your question about the body. And I think like later in life, I live in California. I'm a little bit woo-woo. And so I've done somatic therapy and as part of grief therapy. And I also took many classes at Corporeal Writing, which is Lydia Yugnovich's workshop in Portland. And I realized how much, you hold grief in your body. In certain places, and that includes intergenerational trauma, and it includes a lot of things, and I don't think I wrote those chapters much later than like the reburial chapter, so I think it's kind of a later in life realization. But the theme of motherhood is a central one in this book. I think seeing what my grandmother did to ensure that her family survived is about being a mother, because she was when my grandfather died, she was left with 2 toddlers to raise by herself. And then later she worked at an orphanage. So her whole life was about being a mother. And that was something I've always known I wanted to have kids, even when my high school friends are here and you can ask them. I've always wanted kids. And I have horrible taste in men. And so it was really hard to find someone to have a kid with. And also I was very career focused, and but that was something I knew in my body. It did not come from my intellect. It was something that I love. Kittens and, puppies and, just that is just part of my being. And that's something I struggled with as a young journalist, living in New York. Like, how am I going to have a baby? Do I have one with my gay friends? Do I, what are the options here? And that's definitely a theme in my book. And when I found out about my grandmother, it made me feel closer to her, because that was her, her role as a mother.
Yeah, it's a really interesting juxtaposition of the 2 different. Well, I mean, there are more than 2, but I would say maybe these 2 storylines, trying to recover your grandfather's and your grandmother's history, and moving towards motherhood,
right?
Because it really sort of speaks to this idea that you need to sort of fill in the gaps in that knowledge about your family history before before creating a new generation.
Definitely.
So yeah, and you may have written something like that explicitly at some point, but did you know that from the outset as you started working on this, that that there was also this theme of motherhood, because you did start it, more than 20 years ago now?
Yeah, the purpose of the book has changed over time. And, when I started this book, I thought it was a piece of journalism, and I tried to write it as a piece of journalism, and it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like I was capturing the real story. And I think I just needed to live more to know what the real story was. And what I realize now 25 years later, is this is a story for my kids, so they will grow up knowing who their ancestors were and not have this hole in history, because that's how I grew up, with this hole in history. And I think that's part of the reason why I never felt at home anywhere. And now I realize how important family stories are for development, for identity development, and now there's studies about it in psychology. But it took me a while to realize this is for the next generation. This book is for the next generation. So,
should we go to questions now? Yeah, thank you. So I think we can take a few questions from the audience. Yeah, Hannah.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you.
This is such an amazing book. Just flipping through, you have so many amazing pieces of the archive. You have your family members, tojang, the name stamps. You have so many amazing photos. And then there are the records. Can you tell us a little bit about that process of tracking these records down, tracking down these archival materials? It's so fascinating.
Yeah, part of the book is like a detective story. Where are these records? I know that they exist. I know the Japanese, wrote them. They're not in the archive. They're not at the governmental records office. I spoke to dozens of Korean history professors, and finally I met one that actually mentioned my grandfather's name in one of the articles he'd written. And he said, well, I got some records from this private publisher, which I was like, what's a private publisher? So he gave me his card and said, you should call him. And so I went to his office, which was like at the northern part of Seoul, like almost to the DMZ. And it was slightly janky, and it was like on the second floor above a tailor shop. And I went with my translator, and this guy appeared and he said, I have your grandfather's records. They're here. I bound them. He had the records of all of the people arrested at the same time as my grandfather. So all the people in his student group. And I'm like, okay, can I look at them? And he's like, well, you can't read classical Japanese. I'm like, yes, that's true. And he said, you have to buy them. And they're, I can't remember how many won, but it was approximately $600. So that was, and I'm like, why does this man have these records? And it turned out he was given access to the Seoul Municipal Court basement for an afternoon. His friend worked there and said, there are all these records stacked, just in stacks in the basement. No one's archived them. No one wants to deal with them. Some of them, have been damaged by water. And that's where my grandfather's records were. And this private publisher took pictures of all these, huge stack of records. And that's what I have. And now I found out 25 years later, it's all been archived. So I did contact a very nice colonial history professor at USC, and she verified that they have been archived.
Thank you very much for the interview. It occurred to me that I grew up in Korea, so in the mid-90s, I remember there were actually a lot more of this sort of coming forth, since that's when, after the military regime, we did go into a more civilian administration at that time. And it's interesting, it just occurred to me that a lot of the stories around the conflict, around the Korean War between communism and the South, there's actually a movie called 그 섬에 가고 싶다. I don't know if you know about it, but it's in English it's called To the Starry Island, so it just happens to have the same word. So it actually has that theme, so you may check it out actually. But my question, or I'd like to get your view on, is Korea as a society, I mean, it's really laudable how you've gone through your family history in terms of reliving it and also putting it forth. As a society, I just feel that Korea still hasn't really gotten over it. I think all of these efforts by the committee, I think that's actually done a lot. But one thing I recall recently is, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, is there used to be a Korean general during the Japanese occupation called Hongbom-do Jangun. And he was eventually forcibly relocated to the Soviet Union from Far East to current Kazakhstan. And he was one of the big heroes of a very memorable battle against the Japanese army in current Manchuria. So he was brought back, his remains were brought back from Kazakhstan to Korea a few years ago. And under the current administration, the president actually told because his bust was at the Korean Military Academy, and he told that it should be withdrawn. Because when he was in the Soviet Union, to live, he actually became a member of the Communist Party.
Course.
He didn't have anything to do with North Korea. He died in 1943. So that became a big thing in Korea. And personally, I felt more closer to it because my last name is also Hong. So we may be related in some ways.
Right.
So it's sort of interesting that, although a lot of time has passed as a society and nation, Korea still is affected by this past, and it's being politically used by the current administration to sort of drum up anti-communist. So, do you sort of, in your studies, did you feel that sort of Korea as a society, this sort of trauma from the past, is being healed or is being progressed since you've been working on the book for the past 2 decades?
Well, it kind of goes back and forth. Like, you know, there's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and then there's the, you know, move into the anti-communist, depending on who's in power. You know, I hope this is healing for people, you know, on a personal level. But yeah, I mean, Korean politics is there's a lot of flip flop and moving. From conservative to liberal, and it is, I mean, it's mirrored in our country too, right? We're in the regressive part, not to get too political, but you know, the Cold War is still being fought on many fronts in many countries, but it was an interesting time, you know, because I worked for The Nation. You know, certain people had you know, ideas about who I was, but I was also, my father was also friends with this very conservative historian of Syngman Rhee. And but he was a family friend because we knew him in Houston, and there were so few Koreans in Houston when I grew up. It didn't matter if you're conservative or liberal. You know, it's just like, oh, another Korean, thank God. So some of the scholars, when I said like, oh, I'm Dr. Yu told me to contact you, like they didn't want to speak to me. It's like, why are you even talking to Dr. Yu because he's conservative and you work at The Nation? And I was like, well, you know, I know his kids, you know, and so it was very interesting. Like, I didn't realize that atmosphere existed in Korean studies too, but that was something I faced in Korea, and having to navigate that. Like, some grad students didn't want to speak to me because I associated with a scholar that they did not agree with politically.
Hi. My father was a U.S. Army non-commissioned officer in Korea in 1947. He was stationed at Pohang, and he was a squad leader. And at least one of the members of his squad was killed in action with communist sympathizers. In 1947, the war had yet to break out. Right. And he was also assigned as effectively a drill sergeant to try to train young South Koreans, because everyone knew something was probably going to break out. So my question is, and I'm very surprised that it hasn't been brought up yet, why was your grandfather a communist?
So he was a communist in the 1920s.
Right. But the real question, why did he choose communism? So
he in the 1920s, the Communist Party were anti-imperial. That's why he chose communists, because he did not want Japan to be the colonizer. You know, it's a different era. So this was in the 1920s. He died in 1936. He died before the war. He died before what we know. What communism is today is very different than in the 20s. So that's he was anti-Japanese, and that's why he became a communist.
Which is exactly why Ho Chi Minh.
We also have a question from a online viewer. Chandler asks, I was wondering if Ms. Lee has any advice for those of us who are also trying to find lost records and histories of our Korean family members.
The first advice, I think, is to try and speak to your elders. And if they don't want to talk to you, figure out a way to make them talk to you. I mean, I tell friends, you know, people ask me this all the time. It's like, you can just start, like, even with my father, like, I didn't want to like go straight into the colonial era right away. You know, I started with like, what foods did you eat when you were little? What did your house look like? I'm a very visual person. Like, I had him draw a picture of his house, and you know, where the kitchen was, and it had a dirt floor and the ondol floors, and just so I could have a visual, like where did you live? And I think that's just a good entryway into speaking with your elders is to ask them about food, as Grace in her book, food. What were you like as a kid? And then things will come up, and that's how it was with my father. And then some of the painful stories came out about growing up in colonialism and being given a Japanese name and not learning about Korean history, and so that's my advice, at least personally. With records, now everything is online in Korea, so it's a little bit easier than when I was there.
So firstly, congratulations on your book. I'm so excited to read it.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask actually how the writing process was, and if, and I know it can go both ways, did you find that it was healing for you writing this memoir? Or, I mean, sometimes it also draws things out that can be really difficult to deal with.
It was very heavy, and it felt very heavy. I think that's another reason why it took so long to write. I could only write in spurts. It wasn't something I could motor through because I would, just kind of freeze or need to go lie down. I mean, literally. It just felt like a huge weight sometimes. So I wrote, I mentioned this in the book, I wrote a lot of it in a generative writing workshop after I did all my research. And I think I needed that space, like a very safe space with other writers in community. And I would write in 10, 15-minute spurts and without my notes. And I think that's where the emotion, like the emotion that I feel would come out on the page. And then I, figured out the history and all that later and added it to it. But it definitely took me a while to realize that you need a lot of self-care when you write about family trauma. Sure. And that's another reason why it took so long. So.
Thank you for your questions. I think we're coming up on time, so I'm going to ask one closing question that's sort of related to yours. So I definitely read by the end that there was a sense of closure, but I want to know if you also feel a sense of opening. And if you were to write, let's say, a sequel to this book, what might that look like? Or if there's no sequel in mind, like what would a next project look like? And what has this opened up for you?
I think there's a lifting, like it feels, I don't know, a lot has been lifted. My parents passed away before, the book was published. That's mentioned in the book. And I think that was an impetus for me to finish, after they passed away. I don't know if there's a sequel. I don't know. Kids, what do you think? I mean, there's a lot of research that I didn't put in here, so I don't know. We'll see.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret and Grace, for this conversation. Starry Field is available wherever books are sold, but we have them in the back, so please make sure you purchase a copy and get it, Margaret's signature on it, as well as Grace's. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.